In the 1950s, my white mom was forced to marry the first white man they found after discovering she was pregnant by a black soldier who vanished. This is my family's secret that I only learned about 3 years ago when my mom was dying and decided to tell me the truth about my father. I'm 70 years old now, and I've spent my entire life thinking I knew who I was and where I came from. Finding out the real story has turned everything upside down, but I feel like people need to understand what families went through during that era. I was born in 1953 in a small town in Tennessee. My whole life, I was told that my father was Robert Henderson, a quiet man who worked at a local factory and died in an industrial accident when I was 3 years old. My mother, Dorothy, never remarried and raised me as a single mother, which was unusual enough in those days to raise some eyebrows. Looking back, there were always things that didn't quite add up. I have much darker hair and skin than either my mother or the man I thought was my father. People would sometimes comment that I didn't look much like Robert, but in those days, you didn't question those things too openly. My mother was a very private person who rarely talked about her past or her marriage. She'd get uncomfortable whenever I asked about my father or wanted to see more photos of him. She'd just say that losing him was too painful to discuss and that I should focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. As I got older and started learning about genetics in school, I began to wonder about some of my physical features. I have naturally very curly hair that my mother would always straighten for me, telling me it was more manageable that way. My skin is olive-toned in a way that neither my mother nor Robert's family seemed to have. But this was the 1960s and early 70s, and you didn't question your parents about these things. I got married in 1975 to my wife, Margaret, and we had 2 children. Our son David looks very much like Margaret's side of the family, but our daughter Susan has some of the same features I do, the darker skin tone, the curly hair. Margaret and I used to joke that Susan must have gotten some exotic genes from somewhere in the family tree. My mother lived until she was 89, passing away in early 2020, just before the pandemic really hit. In her final weeks, when she knew she was dying, she started talking about things she'd never mentioned before. She seemed agitated about something, like she had unfinished business. 2 days before she died, she asked me to come sit with her alone. Margaret was in the hospital cafeteria, and it was just the 2 of us in her room. "Tommy," she said, using the childhood nickname she hadn't called me in decades. "There's something I need to tell you about your father. About your real father." I thought she was confused from the medication. "Mom, you don't need to worry about anything right now. Just rest." "No, you don't understand. Robert Henderson wasn't your father. I'm so sorry I lied to you your whole life, but I had to. You have to understand, it was a different time." She was crying, which was something I'd rarely seen her do. My mother was always composed, always in control of her emotions. "What do you mean he wasn't my father?" That's when she told me a story that explained so many things about my childhood and about the way she'd always seemed to be carrying some kind of secret sadness. In 1952, my mother was 19 years old and working as a waitress at a diner near Fort Campbell, which was a major Army base about 50 miles from our town. This was during the Korean War, and the base was full of soldiers training before being deployed overseas. "I met your real father at the diner," she told me. "His name was James Williams, and he was a soldier from Detroit. He was a black man, Tommy, and I fell in love with him." She said that James would come into the diner several times a week when he had leave from the base. They started talking, and despite the enormous social taboos of the time, they began a relationship. "He was the kindest, smartest, most gentle man I'd ever met," she said. "He wanted to be a teacher after the war. He would bring me books, and we'd talk for hours about everything, literature, music, the future we hoped we could have together." Their relationship lasted about 4 months, meeting in secret whenever James could get away from the base. They knew it was dangerous. Interracial relationships weren't just socially unacceptable in 1950s Tennessee, they were literally illegal in many states. "We talked about running away together," my mother said. "James thought maybe we could go north to Detroit, where his family was, where people might be more accepting. But before we could make any plans, he got his deployment orders. James was being sent to Korea. They spent one last weekend together in early 1952, and then he was gone. He promised to write to her and said that when he came back, they'd figure out how to be together. I got 3 letters from him, my mother said, and then nothing. I wrote to him for months, but my letters started coming back undelivered. I tried calling the army, but they wouldn't tell me anything about individual soldiers. By the time she realized she was pregnant, James had been gone for 3 months, and she hadn't heard from him in weeks. I was terrified, Tommy. You have to understand what it was like then. A white woman pregnant with a black man's baby in Tennessee in 1952, it wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. People could be killed for less than that. She went to her parents first, hoping they might help her figure out what to do. Their reaction was immediate and harsh. My father said I had disgraced the family and that I needed to fix the situation before anyone found out. My mother just cried and said she couldn't believe I'd been so stupid. Her parents gave her 2 options: go away to have the baby and give it up for adoption, or find a white man to marry immediately and pass the baby off as his. They said if I kept the baby and people found out the truth, our whole family would be ruined. My father would lose his job, they'd be run out of town. In those days, that wasn't an exaggeration. My mother chose the second option because she couldn't bear the thought of giving up her baby. Her parents put out quiet word that Dorothy Henderson was looking to get married quickly, and within 2 weeks, they'd found Robert Henderson. Robert was 28 years old, had never been married, and was what people then called simple, probably what we now recognize as having an intellectual disability. He lived with his elderly mother and worked at the factory doing basic manual labor. Robert's mother thought it was wonderful that such a pretty young woman wanted to marry her son, my mother said. She didn't ask too many questions about why the wedding was happening so quickly. They got married in a small ceremony in March 1952, when my mother was about 4 months pregnant. To anyone who was counting, it would look like I was born slightly premature, but not suspiciously so. Robert was a good man, my mother said. He was sweet and gentle, and he accepted everything I told him without question. I told him the baby was his, and he was so happy to be a father. He never suspected anything different. Robert treated me as his own son for the 3 years before his death, and my mother said he genuinely loved me. His death in the factory accident was real and tragic, and my mother grieved for him sincerely. But I grieve for James too, every day, she said. I never knew what happened to him. I always hoped he'd come back and find me somehow, but he never did. After my mother died, I was consumed with questions about James Williams and what had happened to him. With the help of my daughter Susan, who's much better with computers than I am, I started trying to research his military service and find out what had become of him. It took months of digging through military records, genealogy websites, and Korean War databases, but we eventually found him. James Williams had been killed in action in Korea in September 1952, just 2 months before I was born. He never received my mother's letters telling him about the pregnancy because he was already dead. We found his grave in a veterans cemetery in Detroit, along with records showing that he'd been awarded a Bronze Star for heroism before his death. We also found an obituary in a Detroit newspaper that mentioned he'd been planning to attend college on the GI Bill after the war to become a teacher, just like my mother had said. Finding out that my real father had died a hero in Korea was emotional in ways I hadn't expected. I'd spent 67 years not knowing this man existed, and now I was mourning him. But we also found something else. James had living relatives in Detroit. He'd had 2 younger sisters, and one of them, Rose Williams Johnson, was still alive at 88 years old. I was terrified to contact her. How do you call someone and say, I think I might be your brother's son from a relationship in Tennessee in 1952? But Susan convinced me that we had to try. When I called Rose, her first reaction was silence. Then she started crying. I knew about you, she said. James wrote to me about your mother before he shipped out. He said he'd met the love of his life and that they were going to get married when he came home. He mentioned her name was Dorothy and that she worked at a diner near the base. Rose said that after James died, the family had tried to contact my mother to let her know what had happened, but they didn't have enough information to find her. We knew her first name and that she worked at a diner, but we didn't know her last name or exactly which town she was from. James was so secretive about the relationship because he knew how dangerous it was for both of them. Rose invited me to come to Detroit to meet the family, and I made the trip with Susan and Margaret. It was surreal to meet aunts, uncles, and cousins I'd never known existed, and to see family resemblances I'd never understood. James's sister had kept some of his things from the war, including a photo of him in uniform. When I saw it, I understood immediately why people had sometimes said I looked different from Robert Henderson. I look exactly like James Williams did at my age. Rose also had the letters that James had written home from basic training, including the ones where he mentioned my mother. He was head over heels in love with her, Rose told me. He wrote about how smart she was, how brave she was for being willing to see past the color of his skin. He was already making plans for their future together. The family welcomed me with open arms, and I've spent the past 3 years getting to know relatives I never knew I had. It's been one of the most amazing and overwhelming experiences of my life, but it's also been complicated. I've had to rethink my entire identity and family history. I've had to grapple with the fact that I'm biracial in a way I never knew, and that my mother spent 67 years carrying this secret alone. I understand why she did it. In 1952 Tennessee, the truth could have gotten her killed and would have certainly destroyed both our lives. The choice she made, to marry Robert and pass me off as his son, was probably the only way to keep us both safe. But I also grieve for what was lost. James never knew he had a son. I grew up without knowing my father or his family. My mother lived her entire life unable to openly mourn the man she'd loved or celebrate the heritage she'd passed on to me. I've also had to confront my own feelings about race and identity. I was raised as a white man in the Jim Crow South, never questioning my place in that system. Finding out that I'm actually the son of a black soldier who died fighting for his country has forced me to reckon with a lot of uncomfortable truths about the world I grew up in. My daughter Susan has embraced this new family history enthusiastically. She's learned about our African American heritage and connected with cousins in Detroit who've helped her understand parts of her identity that she'd always felt but never been able to name. My son David has had a harder time with it. He's struggled with the idea that everything he thought he knew about our family was based on a lie, even if it was a necessary one. Margaret has been incredibly supportive through all of this. "You're the same man you've always been," she told me. "Learning the truth about your father doesn't change who you are or how much I love you." I've been going to counseling to work through all the emotions this discovery has brought up. It's strange to be 70 years old and learning fundamental things about yourself that completely reframe your understanding of your life. I've also been thinking a lot about the choices people had to make during that era and how many family secrets must be buried because of the racial laws and social norms of the time. How many people like me grew up never knowing their real heritage because it was too dangerous to tell the truth? The counselor has helped me understand that there's no right way to feel about any of this. I can be grateful for the sacrifice my mother made to protect me, while also grieving for the father I never knew and the family connections that were severed by racism and war. I've started volunteering with a local organization that helps Korean War veterans and their families. It feels like a way to honor James's memory and connect with the service he gave to his country. I've also been speaking to historical societies about my story, because I think it's important for people to understand what families went through during that era. The choices my mother had to make weren't unique. They were the reality for many interracial couples and their children during a time when love across racial lines was criminalized. James Williams was a hero who died serving his country, but he never got to come home to the woman he loved or meet the son he never knew he had. My mother was a brave woman who sacrificed her own happiness to protect her child, but she had to carry that secret alone for nearly 70 years. I'm proud to be their son, even if I only learned the truth near the end of my life. And I'm grateful that my grandchildren will grow up knowing the full truth about their heritage and the complex, difficult, but ultimately loving story of how they came to be. One of the most challenging aspects of this discovery has been grappling with my own privileges and assumptions. I lived 67 years as a white man in America, benefiting from systems and opportunities that my biological father and his family were systematically denied. I went to segregated schools in the 1960s, never questioning why there were no black children in my classes. I got jobs and promotions without ever having to wonder if my race was a factor. I walked through the world with a confidence and sense of belonging that my father never had the chance to experience. Rose, my father's sister, has been incredibly gracious about this, but I can see the pain in her eyes sometimes when we talk. James would have been so proud of the life you've had, she told me during one of our conversations. But he would have been heartbroken knowing that you got opportunities he never could have dreamed of just because people thought you were white. The generational trauma is something I'm still trying to understand. Rose and her surviving relatives grew up during Jim Crow, lived through the civil rights era, and watched their children and grandchildren navigate a world that was slowly, painfully changing. They've carried the weight of systemic racism in ways I was completely shielded from. When I met my cousin Marcus, James's nephew, he was initially skeptical about my sudden appearance in their lives. "It's convenient," he said during our first meeting, "showing up now when it's safe to be biracial, when it's almost trendy. Where were you during the struggle?" I couldn't argue with his anger. He was right. I'd lived my entire life insulated from the black experience in America, only to discover this heritage when the social cost of claiming it was minimal compared to what earlier generations had faced. It's taken time, but Marcus and I have developed a relationship built on honest conversations about race, privilege, and family. He's helped me understand that my story isn't just about personal discovery. It's about the thousands of families that were torn apart by racist laws and social norms. We've learned that James wasn't the only soldier from his unit who had relationships with local women that had to be kept secret. There's a whole generation of children from that era who may never know their true parentage because of the dangers their parents faced. I've also been researching the broader history of Fort Campbell during the Korean War era and the communities around it. What I found is a complex web of relationships that crossed racial lines despite enormous legal and social barriers. Some of these relationships produced children who, like me, were raised with false parentage information for their own protection. The hardest part has been telling my own grandchildren about this family history. My son David's children, ages 12 and 14, have struggled with understanding why their great-grandmother had to lie and what it means for their own identity. My daughter Susan's kids, who are younger, have been more accepting of the complexity. So we're part black. My 8-year-old grandson asked matter-of-factly. "Yes," I told him. "Your great-great-grandfather was a brave soldier who fought for his country." "Cool," he said, and went back to playing. Sometimes I think the younger generation's casual acceptance of racial complexity gives me hope for the future. I've started donating to organizations that help military families and specifically to groups that preserve the history of black soldiers' contributions to American wars. It feels like a small way to honor James's memory and acknowledge the service he gave to a country that didn't always value his life equally. The 1950s were a different time, but the consequences of that era's racism and the choices people had to make to survive it are still echoing through families today. My story isn't unique. It's just one of the few that finally got told. How many other families are still carrying these secrets? How many other children grew up never knowing their true heritage because the truth was too dangerous to tell? I think about my mother's courage often. She was 19 years old, pregnant, and terrified, but she found a way to protect both of us in an impossible situation. She sacrificed her own happiness and carried a devastating secret for nearly 7 decades so that I could have a safe life. I think about James, too, and the future he planned that never came to be. He died believing he would come home to marry my mother and build a life together. He never knew he had a son who would carry his features and, I hope, some of his character. Most of all, I think about the power of truth, even when it comes late in life. Learning who I really am at 70 has been disorienting and sometimes painful, but it's also been liberating. I understand myself better now. Why I always felt slightly out of place, why certain music and foods resonated with me in ways I couldn't explain, why I was drawn to social justice causes even when my upbringing hadn't prepared me for that awareness. I'm grateful for every day I get to know my father's family and to honor his memory. I'm grateful for the courage my mother showed in telling me the truth before she died. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this story because I believe that acknowledging these hidden histories is essential for understanding how we got to where we are today. TLDR, at 70 years old, I learned from my dying mother that my real father wasn't the white man who raised me, but a black soldier named James Williams who was killed in Korea before I was born. My mother was forced to marry quickly in 1952 to hide her interracial pregnancy. I've now connected with my father's family and am processing a completely different understanding of my identity, privilege, and heritage while grappling with the generational trauma of racism that shaped our family's choices.